afternoon. Wow, what a turnout. I think testament to who our speaker is today. So I'm Russell Alley, and I'm one of the executive directors here at the University of Cape Town, development and alumni. So any of you want to make any donations to the university, I'm the person you speak to. And any of you want to complain about, as alumni, about what's going wrong with the university, there is actually a head of alumni relations. So, what a treat. And we're so pleased to have Clem Sunter with us this afternoon, The World and South Africa Beyond 2018. So Clem Sunter, as we all know, is well known as our country's leading scenario planner. And of course, he is also known for his previous illustrious career at Anglo American. It was, in fact, at Anglo that he first started a scenario planning function. And it actually would be interesting to check with him if the Anglo America of today was in any of the scenarios that they came up with at the time. Clem, of course, then became renowned for his high road and low road scenarios, and which he postulated for South Africa during that very, very dark period of our past. The high road, of course, being a path of negotiation, and the low road being the highway between Johannesburg and Pretoria. And the low road being one of confrontation and civil war. So is scenario planning an art or a science? Clem will probably say a bit of both. What it is not is guesswork or wishful thinking. It's based on serious and extensive research, a rigorous methodology, empirical evidence, and testable hypotheses. There is a place for both logic and emotion, and for Clem, sometimes emotion can trump logic, and that's not intended as some bad pun, because we all know it does not take much these days to trump logic. Now, in Sunter's body of work, there is invariably the metaphorical fox, which by now has become almost a mythical creature. Maybe she should change it to the unicorn. Think like a fox, Sunter implores. For Sunter, thinking like a fox and scenario planning are almost synonymous. And why is he so fascinated with the fox? Because for him, the fox is the quintessential polymath. Unlike the hedgehog character, which always features prominently in many of his works as well, which only knows one big thing, like many UCT academics actually, which is probably why they make such poor scenario planners. The fox knows many things. We should all be so lucky then to be foxes. So why is scenario planning important? Is it just about fanciful prophesizing? For Sunter, it's about being in the best possible position to make sense of our times and to prepare for our futures. Now, I hope Clem forgives me this sort of analogy associated with Karl Marx, but I know that at Anglo American he was required reading. So Karl Marx once famously said, people make their own histories, but not always under the conditions of their own choosing. The Communist Manifesto, then, is probably one of the world's most famous futuristic texts. Who can ever forget its evocative opening statements? A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. The Pope and the Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. So, Mr. Sunter, tell us what spectre is haunting South Africa and the world in 2018 and beyond. What alliances can we expect to be forged over this period? what will be exercised, and what will continue to endure. And then let me also just congratulate Mr. Sunter in closing on the honorary doctorate that the University of Cape Town has conferred on him. So, Dr. Sunter.
Stick it on Marsh wherever you want. Good afternoon, everybody. What a pleasure to be here. I'm not used to have these kind of microphones because before I joined Anglo in '66, I was a member of a British rock band. And we played with microphones like that. Actually, in June '64, we shared a gig with the Rolling Stones. And yeah, I have to say that Mick Jagger was already a prima donna. The nice guy in the group was Keith Richards. He's a super guy. He showed us how to get a bit more edge in some of the guitar solos we would play. And I established that he's exactly the same age as me. He does look a bit older because he's been on more trips. Anyway, I'd like to talk a little bit about a program that Chantal Ilbury and I are running in London at the moment. It's called Growing Foxes on the Shoulder of Giants. And we're testing it out on one very smart girls' school in North London called Mount House. But in fact, quite a few schools elsewhere in London have now signed up to this particular program. What we're trying to do is to teach kids how to look at the future. Because whatever one says, the future is a fascinating subject. It always has been. I mean, that's why you've had prophets, you've had fortune tellers, palmists. It's always been a fascinating subject, unless you're in jail, looking at a wall. Highly predictable. So it is a fascinating subject, and it's a fascinating subject of people of any age, and particularly for young people because they've got the future ahead of them. The second point about teaching kids to be futurists is that it integrates their knowledge, because so many of the judgments about the future involve different subjects, such as geography, such as history, technology, and you have to integrate them to paint scenarios about the future. So you're essentially trying to give the kids cognitive skills at the same time and remove the silos of the subjects that they're being taught. And thirdly, there was a nice statement by somebody the other day which said, nowadays don't get paid for what you know, because Google knows everything. You get paid for what you do with what you know. And yeah, that is one of the reasons why we feel this program is very relevant. Why do we say that it stands on the shoulders of giants? Well, the first giant in my life was Pierre Wack. He was a Frenchman, and he was head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell during the 1970s, and he captured both oil price shocks of the 70s in scenarios, not in forecasts, but in a set of scenarios that he gave to Shell management. And the second oil price shock, Shell actually invested a huge amount of money in additional stocks of oil and made a huge amount out of those additional stocks, something like £1 billion, which in those days was a huge amount of money. So Pierre became very famous overnight, and our Belgian economist in London, working for Anglo, said, you have to listen to this guy. He was about to retire from Shell, and he came out to Johannesburg, and he lectured the Anglo executive, and I was there because I was the secretary of the Anglo Exco at the time. And before he spoke, he said, "Can I light up?" So we all thought he was going to light a Gauloise, speaking French. Instead of which he produced 2 incense sticks and lit them and said, "I think more clearly about the future when I'm smelling incense." So we hired him on the spot. We said, "When you retire from Shell, you must come and work for Anglo." And I'm not kidding when I say that we had the best team of futurists in the world from about 1983 to 93, because Pierre had his circle of remarkable people around the world who assisted him in looking at the future. And of course, one of the outcomes of this work was the high road, low road scenarios in the mid-80s. The second giant was a professor at Oxford when I was there, and indeed I majored in philosophy, so he was one of the people who taught me, Isaiah Berlin, who wrote the book The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he was quoting a Greek poet called Archilochus, who in 650 BC, I mean that's a heck of a long time ago, said, "The hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things." Now, why he said that, nobody knows, but it's a very convenient division between people, because there are people who are fixated on a single idea, and they simply don't move away from that idea, whatever happens. And, when the world goes in a different direction, they issue fake news. Foxes, on the other hand, are people who do not believe that the future is predictable, and you have to play scenarios. And so they believe that it is all about playing multiple scenarios about the future. Not too many, because then you get confused, but at least 2, 3, or 4 different scenarios on the future. So essentially, a scenario planner is a fox. The third person who we rest our program in London on is Charles Darwin, because he had that famous expression, survival of the fittest. And a lot of people think that means survival of the strongest. It doesn't. It means survival of the species who most fit in with the changing requirements of nature. And indeed, that is what a fox does. A fox plays multiple scenarios, adapts his or her strategy as the future unfolds, and isn't fixated on a single idea. So Darwin would have applauded foxes. The fourth person who we use is Karl Popper. He was a great philosopher in the last century, particularly on the issue of science and scientific statements. He made the great conclusion that for a statement to be scientific, it has to be capable of being falsified. Otherwise, it's not scientific. But he talked of the phenomena of the world being divided into 2 categories: clockworks, or clocks, and clouds. Clocks are phenomena which can be analyzed and therefore are fairly predictable. Clouds are like the clouds in the sky. They change shape all the time, and they are beyond analysis. And we thought that this was a very good way of getting across to people that when you're looking at the present, there are 2 things that you should be looking at in order to get a feel for the future. The clockwork flags, which are the trends which are ticking away, and I'm going to give you a few examples in terms of the global economy, and the cloudy flags, which are major events or trends, but you have absolutely no idea where that flag is going to be in the next 24 hours. So Donald Trump is a cloudy flag. The next philosopher is a Scottish philosopher called David Hume, and he wrote a memorable phrase: "Reason is the slave of passion." Not the other way around. And one of the terrible things that futurists tend to do is to project futures that they desire, not what is realistic, but what they desire. And so one of the points that Pierre made is that a good scenario planner removes the blinkers of emotion so that he can see out of the corner of his eyes what possible futures, which may well be inconvenient, could happen. And it just gives you that much wider sight if you try to be objective when looking at the future. And the last guy that we have based our program on is Socrates, because one of the things that Socrates said is don't make any assumptions, no sacred cows. It's all about going back to basics. It's about having a debate. And we feel that the best way to look at the future is not just a single person, though a person can debate with himself or herself, but rather in a group where you really debate the future. And sometimes you meet yourself coming the other way. And that's just the whole point about debate, is to try and work out what the most logical description of the future might be. So that's what we're teaching the A-level. These are all girls who are doing A-level at a place called Mount House in North London, and they're going through this entire program. And they're loving it because last term they actually spent a whole afternoon from 2 o'clock, and they're supposed to break up at 3:30, doing Brexit scenarios. And a lot of worried parents called in at 6 o'clock saying, "Where's my daughter?" And what came out of this was that in subsequent conversations over Christmas and stuff, these girls had the most amazing skills in terms of discussing a big picture issue like Brexit. And so you mustn't underestimate how young people can think in a very sophisticated way about the future if they're given the tools to do so. We also had an exercise where we said, imagine a scenario where you go to a party and you're instantly attracted to somebody at the party, and then you go out on a few dates, and then it's time to make the decision as to whether it should be a long-term partnership or not. What are the 5 flags that would indicate that this is a sensible decision before reason is subsumed by passion? And interestingly, parents came up as a flag. And one of the teachers said, you know, I was very keen on this man until we went to his parents' house, and he had birds on the wall. Flying birds on the wall. And she said that was as bad as a garden gnome. So, yeah. The point we're trying to get across with being a futurist is that it's not about making huge intuitive leaps into the future. It's much more about trying to analyze the present and the past in a way that gives you a real feel for plausible scenarios of the future. So Chantal and I wrote this book, The Mind of a Fox. We published it in June 2001. And yeah, it didn't sell well to begin with, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit. It was the best-selling book of any title in 2002 in South Africa. And in 2003, it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. But it's now gone into at least 25, 26 editions. It's still an incredibly popular book. And in it, we argue that you're likely to have a more successful life if you behave like a fox. Not just in terms of entertaining multiple possibilities, but having, you see, now that's a scenario. Not just in entertaining different possibilities about the future, but also in acting, because foxes are very agile creatures, and so you can't just look at the future. You've got to decide what your best options are, and then you've got to implement them. And so we always stress both points in being a fox. You've got to be adaptable, and you've got to be agile. So what turned the book into a bestseller? Well, it was a letter that we wrote to George Bush in the book, in which we said that part of his legacy as President of the United States would be determined by the speed and quality of his response to certain extreme futures that might come his way. And we nominated as his number one extreme future a massive terrorist strike on an American city, which would completely turn his presidency upside down and possibly lead America into a gilded cage where it shut itself off from the rest of the world, the kind of policy that Trump is adopting now. And it happened 3 months after we published the book, in 9/11. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world in 2001 that in a formal letter, so it wasn't fiction, a formal letter to the president said, "This is your biggest threat." And why do I know this? Because I got a phone call from the State Department, not the CIA, the State Department. So I was a person of interest. And I said, we didn't have any inside information on this attack. There's just no way that we would have said that it was going to happen 3 months after we published the book, that it would happen in New York, and it would be about planes. That requires inside knowledge. But the idea of a massive terrorist strike happening in America had gone up in probability because we had 3 flags, Chantal and I. Number one was the growing confrontation between the major religions of the world, which really began in the late 1980s between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and intensified in the 90s. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist groups, particularly those based in Afghanistan, in terms of their tactics and equipment during the 1990s. But the flag that convinced us that something could happen in America was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa in 1998, one in Tanzania and the other in Kenya, which we believe was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in America. And we've always wondered if we'd done a presentation to the CIA in, say, June 2001, they might have reperceived some of the genuine flags that they were getting, which we obviously knew nothing about. It came out in the congressional inquiry after 9/11 that there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, "Boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." Big clue. But it was ignored. It was ignored, even though she put it forward 6 times. And that's precisely why you have to be a fox, because you've got to be prepared for the future to change suddenly, and you've got to be prepared to act. And if they had taken her information seriously, they could have closed the whole operation down, because 2 of the suicide pilots actually went to that school. So we couldn't have had our methodology verified in a more dramatic form than that. And overnight we became quite big celebrities in America. And since then we've been doing work all around the world using the methodology that we have written up in 3 books, Mind of a Fox, Games Foxes Play, and Socrates and the Fox. And so this latest venture in London is for us very interesting, and we've already got private schools in South Africa who have signed up. Last week I was with Somerset College, which is the first school in the Western Cape to want to do it, and in Johannesburg today. My co-author is talking to St. John's, who want to present it to their kids, and Rodine. And so, yeah, it's just a nice way to get kids interested in looking at the future and giving them a perfectly reasonable model to do so. But what are the kind of flags that our international clients are talking to us about now in terms of possible ways of affecting their business? Number one, I'm afraid to say, is the religious flag. It's still flying very high. We haven't had anything as stunningly large as 9/11, but we seem to have terrorist events on a regular basis in major cities. It means that the cost of intelligence has gone up dramatically. It has made policies on immigration far more complex than they used to be. And obviously, there are places where it is dangerous to send staff because of the religious flag. For example, in many Middle Eastern countries and countries in North Africa. So it is a flag, and it is particularly affecting, unfortunately, the Middle East, where I don't think the region has been in a darker space than it is today. I mean, there was just footage yesterday of more bombing in Syria. It is just ghastly, and Yemen is also absolutely ghastly. So it's a terrible flag that's gone up. I mean, I recently did a cruise on an American cruise ship, and my co-speaker was an ex-Egyptian ambassador to Washington. And he said in his presentation that when he was brought up in Egypt, there was no distinction between Sunni and Shia. And it is terrible how this flag has not only divided people on a religious basis, it's obviously divided people within a religion as well. So it is something that you have to watch. Luckily in South Africa, the flag is down. I mean, we talk a huge amount about race and colour, but we hardly ever talk about religion in South Africa being a divisive issue. And we still can't completely be calm about the flag, because we have places like the waterfront with many American tourists, and so one has to be aware of the kind of abnormal behavior which could precede a terrorist event. So, religion. The second flag is what we call the red flag, and it's made up of 3 countries. Firstly, Russia. I mean, we had a cooling off period after Gorbachev got rid of the Soviet Union, but unfortunately we're back into a Cold War, and the critical event was the annexation of Crimea, which overnight meant that sanctions were reapplied between the European Union and America on the one hand and Russia on the other. So we're back into a kind of Cold War, and that has obviously increased the risks, particularly of European businesses doing trade in Russia. And just remember that 25% of Europe's energy needs come from Russia. So, you know, it's a flag that has to be watched. You have to watch Mr. Putin. And you obviously have to consider, you know, whether in places like Syria, America will ever go head-to-head with Russia. The second part of the flag is China. And we make one point about China, which is this, that this is the Chinese century. Every century belongs to a nation. The 19th century belonged to Britain. The 20th century belonged to America. The 21st century belongs to China, because in 2032, as currently predicted by some of the top economic forecasting organizations in the world, in 2032, China becomes the largest economy in the world. And yeah, they're already increasing their influence in the world, care of Donald Trump, retreating on issues like climate change. The Chinese are stepping in. So it's quite weird, this, because we've had 2 centuries dominated by English-speaking nations, and now we're going to be dominated by a nation that speaks Mandarin. And this is going to open up all kinds of things. I did a session for the Chinese Communist Party back in April 2006, because they liked our methodology. So I went to a place called the Central Party School. It's the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, founded by Chairman Ma in 1949 after the Long March. And it is the kind of leadership school for future leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. And they also write the 5-year plans for China. And they wanted to know how to road test these plans using scenarios, and they asked me to go and lecture them. And one of the things that really came out of my experience at the school is that, you know, there is a huge difference in thinking. And even though I had this very kind of intimate conversation about China's strategy, did I come up knowing more about what China's future would be in the long term? Not really. So it's going to be quite challenging for a lot of futurists when China does actually take the number one position. One of the interesting things at the school, and I'll refer to it later on, was that in every classroom, because they showed me around the school afterwards, since so few foreigners actually visit the school, they'd taken down all the slogans of Mao and replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping. And when I asked one of the professors why, he said, in 1978, we were the 100th ranked economy in the world. Now we're number 5, and of course now they're number 2. And he said it was because Deng did 2 things. He put a huge emphasis on infrastructure and improving infrastructure in China, and he opened up our economy to wealth creation, both by the Chinese themselves and by foreign companies. And he said those 2 things have propelled us to number 5 in the world. And so it is interesting how much, even though they still call themselves the Communist Party, they have changed in terms of their philosophy. And of course, one of the famous quotations of Deng was, "I don't care if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." In other words, he was a pragmatist. He wasn't an ideologue, he was a pragmatist. And of course, you know, I don't want to prejudge what I'm going to say on South Africa. That's what we need now, is we need serious pragmatism to get South Africa out of the hole that it is in. The third flag that people talk about is not mentioned much in the press, but we call it the grey flag. It's the aging of the world's population. I mean, just one statistic at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, the average lifespan of an American was 47 years. By the end of the century, that's 100 years, it was 83 for men, 86 for women. So we more or less doubled the average lifespan in 100 years due to medical advances. And this has created huge problems because all the baby boomers are now geriatric boomers. And yeah, I mean, just look at all the news on the National Health Service in the UK. I mean, it's amazing. You know, the kind of waits of 4 hours, 5 hours, even when people had some fairly serious problems. And there are even cancer operations which have been postponed because of the fact that, you know, the NHS is just being totally overwhelmed because of this flag. But the other thing it's doing is it's slowing down economic growth rates. I mean, European economic growth rates will probably never go above 0.5% again. Japan, which is the oldest nation on earth, used to have an economic growth rate of 7 or 8% per annum until they had a property crash in 1990. And since then, they've kind of stumbled along somewhere between 0 and 0.5%. And the reason is simple. Old people don't eat as much. They don't do anything as much. So, essentially, Japan is now in a steady economic state, virtually 0 economic growth, with a declining population. That's Japan. America's different. America's still a relatively young society because of its more generous immigration, and therefore, even though they've got a sudden rise in old people, it is still a young population, and therefore its economic growth rate is not going to be as affected as Europe and Japan. Meanwhile, China has had to go back from a one-child policy to a two-child policy because they've seen how the one-child policy is starting to really slow down their economy. And so they've now gone back to a two-child policy. In the rest of the world, you still have some economies growing at 5% or more if they have quality governments, and it's because they have much younger populations. So one of the points I've made to people, particularly investment managers like Alan Gray and others, is this flag is actually very important in terms of where you put your money, and I've been proved absolutely right. I mean, the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1999 peaked at around 11,700. What is it at the moment? 25,500. So it's well more than double what it was. Whereas the English stock market, FTSE as it's called, was 6,500 at its peak, and it's now 7,600. So, you know, America's performed far better than Europe or Japan in terms of its stock market, and I believe it's because of this grey flag. The next flag is a very cloudy flag. We call it the anti-establishment flag. It's the fury that the middle class have with the super rich. And yeah, it started going up about 5 years ago. Because what's happened since the crash of 2008 is the rich are back to being very rich, but middle-class people are not. There was an interview during the recent election in the UK where Theresa May was asked on Question Time, how can you say you believe in the NHS when I, as a nurse in the NHS, have not had more than a 1% increase since 2008? And that hasn't even kept up with inflation. So you've got a lot of anger against the political establishment and against the super rich. And of course, it has expressed itself in some very surprising events. Brexit. I mean, Brexit wasn't a sort of a deeply analytical economic decision. It was the North versus the South. Simple as that. And of course, the other one is the election of Donald Trump. Even though he's a billionaire, he managed to create this sort of anti-establishment momentum, which got him the election. And this is still around today, so you have to watch where the flag is operating. It's operating in Austria. It's operating in Germany. It's a very powerful flag, and it is continuing to change the political dynamics of many nations. The last flag that our international clients raise with us is the green flag of climate change. And one of the points that I made in a book with Roy Siegfried, who is an ornithological expert, and Brian Huntley, who used to run Kirstenbosch, the three of us in this particular book, which we produced in 1989, called South African Environments into the 21st Century, we said it's not the gradual warming up of the world that is really important, it's the greater frequency of extreme weather events. And that's what we have now. We have extreme droughts followed by extreme rainfalls. And I mean, I keep in touch with the Californian experts on climate change because they've had all of this. They had the worst drought since, well, I think it was the 1850s in California till the beginning of last year, and then they had a lot of rain and they thought that's fixed it, but of course then they had the terrible fires, and more recently they've had this terrible mudslide into Montecito. So it's just that the pendulum is swinging more widely. And of course, where could it affect next? Here, right here, Cape Town. Now, a lot of statisticians, and I hear one of them said to you yesterday, you know, it's a 1 in 1,000 year event. That's not true. According to the new rules of climate change, it could be a 1 in 2. In other words, climate change has completely changed the probabilities of drought and getting water. And if you talk to the experts, they will tell you that the mixture of the highs and lows in the mid-Atlantic have changed to the point that the lows are going further south. And we used to get the full effect of those lows. Now we're only getting a partial effect of those lows. And, you know, this could have huge consequences. I mean, the day zero is now put at April the 22nd. And I have to say, nobody has actually said what happens on day zero. The only thing that's been said is that we've got 200 water points in Cape Town. That's for a population of 4 million people. That's 20,000 people per water point. I mean, how long are you going to wait in a queue? And after you've waited, you're going to have to carry 25 kilos. I defy anybody in this room. carry 25 kilos of water. And yeah, I mean, essentially some of the extreme implications of this scenario for Cape Town is that 2 million people will have to evacuate the city later this year if we genuinely have a day zero, because you can live for 5 days without water. And there's no way that you can bring 26,000 trucks a day into the center of Cape Town to basically help people survive. It's just too many trucks, and as I said, 200 emergency points are not going to help 4 million people. And it's all, if you're a scenario planner, you would say, what is the full narrative? And of course, if people are desperate for water, you're going to see social unrest. And so the idea that you've got your swimming pool, you've got your tanks, you've got everything, not necessarily if things really go, become sort of havoc in Cape Town. So that's why you do scenarios. I wrote an article at the beginning of last year saying, what if the taps run dry for News 24? And I said, I did a session with Perth 12 years ago in which they decided to build a very large desalination plant. And thank heavens they did, because they didn't run out of water about 4 years after they built this plant. We haven't done that. We're building 3 small desalination plants. We're accessing the aquifers for more water, and we're looking at recycling water. But it's just not enough in terms of time. We're still almost 100 million litres a day above the target of 500 million, and so we've all got to consider, what are we going to do? That's what foxes do. They say, not just here's the scenario, but what are we going to do about it? I mean, there's Swellen Dam. There's Hermanus. It's got a separate water system. But that's why you play scenarios. That's why you look at the flags and play scenarios, is because there are things that can really impact upon you. And that brings me to the third nation, which was part of our red flag, which is North Korea. Obviously, everybody's worried about what Trump is doing in calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man and other phrases, because if the two go to war, the principal casualty will be South Korea. It won't be America, it'll be South Korea. And in talking to several young South Koreans the other day, they said, we're all in the same state as you. You have the drought, which you're facing like that. We have the prospect of a possible attack from North Korea. And it's not nice living in that kind of box. And, you have to consider your options. So what about South Africa? What are the flags that our South African companies that we do business with raise? Number one, corruption. So there's nothing new about this, but they said, if we don't sort out corruption, we're going to run out of money, and we're going to be like Venezuela. And the one place you do not do business these days is Venezuela. Venezuela's run out of food. People are walking across the borders into other countries. The wheels have really come off the Venezuelan economy, even though they're an oil-rich country, and it's because of corruption. Brazil used to be considered an absolute star, but it's slowed down because of corruption. And the same is true here. Our economy has slowed down in the last five to 6 years because of corruption. So we're at a momentous point in our history where we've got Cyril Ramaphosa now. The question is, what is he going to do? Is this commission on state capture really going to do something about it? Because the difference between 10 years ago and now is that 10 years ago we had a lot of money and it could be stolen. Now we have very little money and it can't. And it is a very, very important flag to watch. I mean, we've had pushback. I mean, the great thing about this country is we've had a very strong media, very strong social media. So there's been a lot of pushback against corruption. But is it going to turn into real accountability? I don't know. The terrible thing is that companies, capitalism in sort of private markets, they are judged much quicker on issues like this than countries. I mean, Steinhoff shares fell 95% in 2 days. The Rand has fallen 95% since 1980. So that's 37 years. It's taken for the Rand to fall 95%. It was one. Can you imagine? 1980, 1 Rand equaled $1.32. So yes, this is a very important flag to watch. The second one is around quality of infrastructure. I've quoted China, and how the point is that China's had this fabulous economic growth rate because it's put such huge emphasis on infrastructure. Here we've got to do the same, and we're not just talking physical infrastructure like roads and bridges and stuff like that and electricity. We're talking the invisible stuff like education and health. That's what government supplies, and it's got to be of a high quality for that flag to turn green. I mean, one session I did the other day, a CEO said, in some countries you drive on the left of the road. In South Africa you drive on what's left of the road. So we've got a long way to go. The third flag that you should watch to decide whether we're going to, take an upward trajectory is around leadership. Leadership is very important in a country. It's like soccer. I mean, Manchester United won every single trophy on earth, many times, under Sir Alex Ferguson, because he kept Manchester United united. And you need a leadership which makes South Africa into a united team. I don't think we've been more divided than we are now since 1994. And, we're going to have extraordinary leadership to bring us together again in order for us to compete in the global economy. So leadership is the third flag. The fourth flag is around pockets of excellence. The one really positive aspect of South Africa is we have incredible pockets of excellence, and a sad point to make, if you have money you can lead a life here as good as it is in the US, Britain, anywhere else in the world, because we have fantastic shopping malls and everything else. So the flag is really, are we going to replicate those pockets of excellence, or are we going to dumb them down? If we dumb them down because they're seen as too elite, then of course you've got problems. It's just like with a soccer team. If you lose your stars, you're not going to win any trophies. The last flag to watch is the most important one of all, besides corruption, and that's entrepreneurial spark. Because what makes nations great are not so much political leaders. It's the guys who have that spark. Think of why America is #1 in the world. It's not because of the great presidents of the last century. It's because they had Henry Ford. Then they had Walt Disney. Then they had Bill Gates. And more recently, Steve Jobs. How many of you know that Steve Jobs actually was a Syrian adopted by American parents? Yeah, absolutely. He went to his father's restaurant in LA, and his father was very proud to say that Steve Jobs has been to my restaurant without knowing that it was his son. But he got told about that later. But that's the incredible thing about America. No wonder people are against Trump, because it's often immigrants who become the real stars, the real entrepreneurial stars in America. The latest one being a boy who was educated at Pretoria Boys High, Elon Musk. So, yeah. And the point I make is the nature of work has changed. That's another flag. When I was young, companies were creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. In the mining industry, all kinds of industry, it was all about huge numbers of people. Now, automation, robots, AI, call it what you like. that's driven a stake through major workforces. And so you want to create 5 million jobs in South Africa, you're going to have to create 1 million new businesses. It's as simple as that. So the real question is, how do we create 1 million new businesses in South Africa? And that might create the 5 million jobs we need. And I think we need an economic CODESA. And, you know, Cyril would be excellent at doing that because he did a great job with Rolf Meyer. He should do it again, I think, because it does mean some serious decisions about the shape of our economy, because it is too exclusive at the moment. And the township economies are very siloed from the mainstream economy. What are we going to do to break all the barriers down in our economy without, I have to say, losing our pockets of excellence? It's going to have to be some kind of trade-off between the two. So those are the 5 flags that are raised by our South African CEOs. If they remain red, we are in a scenario, well, you know, it's called second division, possibly failed state. I now call it going bust. Because I want to get across that switching leaders from Zuma to Ramaphosa does not change reality, which is there is a precipice right in front of us. We've slowed the momentum towards the precipice, but there is a financial precipice in front of us. And we now have a chance of turning left or right before we go over the precipice. If it's left and it's same old socialist theory, which the Chinese have given up on, then we will just go down slowly. If we actually do the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, turn that entrepreneurial flag green, then we have a very good chance of entering the other scenario, which I used to call Premier League, but I now call turnaround. Simple as that, turnaround. And that's why you need some real pragmatism now, because we've got a real chance of going bust as a nation, but with sensible leadership, we can turn around. And if you ask me to sort of put probabilities on those 2 scenarios, because Cyril hasn't really sent out any flags at the moment. I mean, I'm a great fan of his because I used to negotiate with him when he was General Secretary of the NUM and I was the CEO of Anglo's Gold Division. And yeah, he was a very hard negotiator. But when we had a deal, he stuck to it. Never once did he break any deal that we'd agreed. So for me, Cyril was a great guy. He has a fantastic wife as well. And so I'm very pleased that he's got into a leadership position now. But what we've got to see, that's the whole point of scenarios and flags, is we've got to see some indicators now for us to give the turnaround a higher probability. I'd like to end with one story about one pocket of excellence to leave you on a high and not reaching for your passport. To either escape the drought or escape going bust. I was the chairman of the Anglo Scholarship Panel for 25 years, and we interviewed the brightest students in South Africa for one open scholarship to university. And in 2008, we interviewed the brightest guy we'd ever had in front of our panel. This guy was just 17 years old. He got 8 straight A's in matric when he was 16. He got a scholarship to St. John's College in Johannesburg when he was 15. He comes from Umtata, and his name is Siyabulela Zuza. And the first question we put to him is, what degree have you chosen and why? He said, I've chosen chemical engineering at UCT, and the reason is I've developed this passion for chemicals, which at the age of 12 I used to mix in my mother's kitchen, causing minor explosions to our utter dismay. And then I focused on a project which was to create a rocket fuel that was more energy intensive than the stuff NASA uses to propel its rockets into outer space. It took me 2 years. I cracked the formula. I assembled a team. We built a rocket and I put in my fuel, and we beat the South African amateur altitude record. The project came to the attention of NASA, and they asked me to send them samples of my fuel, and they immediately named a minor planet after me. I mean, how many of you in this room know that a 17-year-old black South African has a minor planet named after it by NASA for the advances he's made to rocket fuel? It's called the Siazusa planet, and it's quite near Jupiter in the sky. And the guy's a genius. But let me tell you the second half of the story. 3 weeks after we awarded him the scholarship, because obviously we gave him the scholarship, he comes running up to me at Oliver Tambo and says, "Hey, Mr. Sunter, remember me?" I said, "Sia, I'm never going to forget you. How's UCT?" He says, "You haven't heard." So I said, "No." He said, "Harvard University have awarded me a 4-year open scholarship to study chemical engineering at Harvard, all expenses paid. So you can have your scholarship back." So he completed his 4-year degree with huge academic distinction at Harvard. At the second last launch of the Endeavour space shuttle, he was the official guest of NASA with 2 other special guests, Barack and Michelle Obama, as a result of which Michelle Obama is now one of his greatest fans and has been trying to persuade him to stay in America. But the last news I have is he's back in South Africa. He started a company on alternative energy to replace fossil fuels, and I wish him the best of luck. But that's the kind of talent that we have, and that's the kind of talent that we must foster to get into a true long-term turnaround. So I hope I've entertained you. I hope I've told you how to look at the future like a fox. I can even get maybe one of those girls to come and give you a lecture next year. And I've given you the 5 global flags to watch, but obviously there are others. The whole point is to say, what is it about the present that is changing the future? South Africa, if the flags turn green that I gave you, we're into a turnaround. If they don't, I'm afraid to say we can go over the cliff and we can go bust. So it is a very important moment in our history, and I'd like to leave you with a benediction for all of you in this room. May the fox be with you. Thank you. Okay, I can take 2 questions and then we have to finish because it's nearly 2 o'clock. Yeah. Yeah, what's the question? Yes.
The question is, how do you identify a flag? What are the criteria you use in deciding this is a flag?
Okay, the criteria we use is to say what events or trends are changing the game. So, for example, it is very obvious that the grey flag of ageing has changed the game of health in the UK. And, I mean, a terrible thing that 97% occupancy of hospital beds. Well, that's the flag of ageing. Just like the flag of technology has changed the world of work. So it's not incredibly Nobel-winning stuff to choose a flag. The critical question to ask yourself is, what are the things that are changing my game as a business? In my markets, what are the things that are changing my market? So, for example, I recently did a bank, and one of the biggest things changing banks is that you can do virtually anything now on a smartphone, and therefore the role of a branch has to change completely, because a lot of those roles now are taken by technology and smartphones. So that's why we ask for flags. In the conversation model, we talk about the rules of the game and the key uncertainties, but the rules of the game include the clockwork flags, and the key uncertainties include the cloudy flags. But obviously there are other things, like changes in legislation, which can affect your game, and they're not so much a flag as a change in the rule of the game. One more question? Yes. Okay, 2 more questions. So that's... Sorry?
What, in your opinion, is the future of Bitcoin?
Oh, what is the future of Bitcoins? Whoa. I haven't got a Bitcoin, I have to say. I haven't got one. And to be honest, I'm not going to buy one because I don't understand it. I mean, obviously, I understand that blockchains are sort of democratic systems of storing information so that it can't change. And that is absolutely the logic that underlies the Bitcoin. But I just can't bring myself to buy a Bitcoin for $14,000. Maybe when they were 10 cents. But of course, the real thing is that everybody wants to copy Bitcoin now. So there's just every day somebody's announcing a new kind of form of cryptocurrency. So I have no idea where it's leading. But that, you see, is exactly why you've got to use the kind of foxy technique to tease out what the consequences are for everything with that kind of thing. Last question. Yes?
To me, overpopulation,
yeah.
In other words, too many people for the resources available,
yes.
is the biggest flag of the problem.
Yeah.
But you can't just stop off new children being born because they're
No.
over the age of population. So you've got to tackle it at both ends.
Yep, the question is absolutely correct. You know, one of the things, the green flag of climate change, one of the causes is attributed to the fact that we are 7 billion people on this earth, whereas for most of the Earth's history up till I think it was about 1820, we had less than 1 billion people. And we're now 7, and the UN estimates 11 billion at the turn of the century. And it's not just climate change, it's displacement of other species. It's cutting the lungs of the earth, which are the tropical forests. And yes, it is a terribly difficult subject. We all know that in many ways it's politically incorrect to even recommend managing population. But that's the point of this process. If I was doing a session, following up on the Paris Accord with some of the top climate change scientists in the world, I would be saying, do you really believe that we can resolve this problem without stabilizing population and even bringing it down? Answer it in a true fashion. Because a lot of people say, no, what we're going to do is remove the carbon footprint, by smarter energy systems. I think it's going to have to be a combination of the two. I think we're going to have to discuss at least population management as well as ways to reduce the average carbon footprint, particularly of, amongst the developed nations, both. So, yeah, absolutely right to ask that question. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.